Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 1. Out to Sea. I had this story from one who had no business to tell it to me, or to any other. I may credit the seductive influence of an old vintage upon the narrator for the beginning of it, and my own skeptical iniquity during the days that followed for the balance of the strange tale. When my convivial host discovered that he had told me so much, and that I was prone to doubtfulness, his foolish pride assumed the task the old vintage had commenced, and so he unearthed written evidence of informed the musty manuscript, and the dry official records of the British Colonial Office to support many of the salient features of his remarkable narrative. I did not say this story is true, for if I did not witness the happenings which it portrays, but the fact that it is telling of it to you, I have taken fictitious names for principal characters quite sufficiently evidences the sincerity of my own belief that it may be true. The yellow mildewed pages of the diary of a man long dead, the records of the Colonial Office dovetail perfectly within the narrative of my convivial host, and so I give you the story as I painstakingly pieced out from the several various agencies. If you do not find it credible, you will at least be as one with me in acknowledging it is unique, remarkable, and interesting. From the records of the Colonial Office, from the dead man's diary, we learn that a certain young English nobleman, whom we should call John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, was commissioned to particularly delicate investigation of the conditions in a British West Coast African colony from whose simplest native inhabitants other European power was known as to be reoccurring soldiers for the native army, which it was used solely for the forcible collection of rubber and ivory from the savage tribes along the Congo and Aruwimi. The natives of the British colony complained that many of their young men were enticed away through the medium of fair and glowing promises, but that few, if any, ever returned to their families. The Englishmen in Africa went even further, saying that those poor blacks were held in the virtue of slavery. Since their terms of enlistment expired, their ignorance imposed upon their white officers, and they had told that they had yet several years to serve. And so the Colonial Office appointed John Clayton to a new post in British West Africa, but his confidential instructions centered on a thorough investigation of the unfair treatment of black British subjects by the offers of a friendly European power. Why he was sent is, however, of the little moment to the story, for he never made an investigation, nor in the fact that he ever reached his destination. Clayton was the type of Englishman that likes to best associate with the noblest monuments of historic achievement upon thousands of victorious battlefields. A strong, virile man mentally, morally, and physically. In stature, he was above average in height. His eyes were gray, features regular and strong, his carriage that of perfect, robust health influenced by years of army training. Political ambition had caused him to seek transference from the army to the Colonial Office, and so we find him, still young, instructed with a delicate and important commission in the service of the Queen. When he had received his appointment, he had both elated and appalled. The preferment seemed to him in the nature of a well-merited reward for painstaking and intelligent service, and stepping stone to posts of greater importance and responsibility. But on the other hand, he had been married to the Hon, Alice Rutherford, for scarce 3 months, and it was thought of taking this fair young girl into the dangers of isolation of tropical Africa that dismayed and appalled him. For her sake, he would have refused the appointment, but she would not have it so. Instead, she insisted that he accept, and indeed take her with him. There were mothers and brothers and sisters and aunts and cousins to various opinions on the subject, but as to what they severally advised, history is silent. We know only on that a bright May morning in 1888, Lord Greystoke and Lady Alice sailed from Dover on their way to Africa. A month later, they arrived at Freetown, where they had chartered a small sailing vessel, the Fulda, which was to bear them to their final destination. And here John, Lord Greystoke, and Lady Alice, his wife, vanished from the eyes of the knowledge of men. 2 months after they weighed the anchor and cleared the port of Freetown, half a dozen British war vessels were scouring the South Atlantic for trace of them or their little vessel, and it was almost immediately that the wreckage was found upon the shores of St. Helena, and which convinced the world that the Fulda had gone down with on board, and hence the search was stopped ere and scarce begun. Though hope lingered in longing hearts for many, the Fulda, a barkentine of about 100 tons, was a vessel of the type often seen in coast-wide trade in far southern Atlantic. Their crews are composed of the offscourings off the sea of unhanged murderers and cutthroats of every race and every nation. The Fulda was no exception to the rule. Her officers were swarthy bullies, hating and hated by their crew. The captain, while a competent seaman, was a brute in his treatment of men. He knew, or at least he used, but 2 arguments in his dealings with them: a belang pin and a revolver. Nor is it likely that the motley agitation he signed would have been understood aught else. So it was that from the second day from Freetown, John Clayton and his young wife witnessed scenes upon the deck of the Fulda which such they had believed were never enacted outside the covers of printed stories of the sea. It was on the morning of the second day that the first link was forged of that was destination to the chain of circumstances, ending the life for one then unborn such he has probably never been paralleled in the history of man. 2 sailors were washing down the decks of the Fulda. The first mate was on duty, and the captain had stopped to speak with John Clayton and Lady Alice. The men were working backwards toward the little party whose were facing away from the sailors. Closer and closer they came, until one was directly behind the captain. Another moment he would have passed the strange narrative had he never been recorded. But just that instant the officer turned to leave Lord and Lady Greystoke, and as he did so, tipped against the sailor and sprawled headlong upon the deck, overturning the water pail so that he had drenched it in its dirty contents. For an instant the scene was ludicrous, but only for an instant. With a volley of awful oaths he faced the suffused with the scarlet mortification and rage. The captain regained his feet, and with a terrific blow felled the sailor to the deck. The man was small and rather old, so that the brutality of the act was thus accentuated. The other seaman, however, was neither old nor small, a huge bear of a man, with a fierce black mustache and a great bull neck set between massive shoulders. As he saw his mate go down, he crouched, and with a low snarl sprang up upon the captain, crushing him to his knees with a single mighty blow. From scarlet the officer's face went white, from his mutiny, and mutiny he had met and subdued before his brutal career. Without waiting to rise, he whipped a revolver from his pocket, firing point blank at the great mountain of muscle towering before him. But, quick as he was, John Clayton was almost as quick, and so that which bullet was intended for the sailor's heart lodged in the sailor's leg instead, for Lord Greystoke had struck down the captain's arm as he had seen the weapon flash in the sun. Words passed between Clayton and the captain, the former making it plain that he was disgusted and brutally displayed toward the crew, nor would he countenance anything further of the kind while he and the Lady Greystoke remained passengers. The captain was on the point of making an angry reply, but thinking better of it, turned on his heel and, black and scowling, strode aft. He did not care to antagonize an English official, for the Queen's mighty arm wielded a punitive instrument which he could appreciate and which he feared: England's far-reaching navy. The two sailors picked themselves up, the older man assisting his wounded comrade to rise. The big fellow, who was known among his mates as Black Michael, tied his leg gingerly, and finding that it bore weight, then turned to Clayton with a word of gruff thanks. Though the fellow's tone was surely, his words were evidently well meant, ere had scarce finished his little speech, he had turned his limping off toward the forecastle with very apparent intention of forestalling any further conversation. They did not see him again for several days, nor did the captain vouchsafe them more than their surliest of grunts when he was forced to speak to them. They must in his cabinet, as they had before the unfortunate occurrence, but the captain was careful to see that his duties never permitted him to eat the same time. The other officers were coarse, illiterate fellows, but above the villainous crew they bullied, and they were only too glad to avoid social intercourse with the polished English noble and his lady, so that the Claytons were left very much to themselves. This in itself accorded perfectly with their desire, but it also isolated them from the life of their little ship, so they were unable to keep in touch with the daily happenings which were to accumulate so soon in a bloody tragedy. There was a whole atmosphere of the craft, that undefinable something which presages disaster. Outwardly, to the knowledge of the Claytons, all went as before upon the little vessel, but that there was an undertow leading them toward some unknown danger both felt, though they did not speak of it to each other. On the second day after the wounding of Black Michael, Clayton came on deck just in time to see a limp body of one of the crew being carried by four on his fellows, while the first mate, a heavy belaying pin in his head, stood glowering at the little party of sullen sailors. Clayton asked no questions. He did not need to, and the following day, as the great lines of a British battleship grew out in the distant horizon, he half determined to demand that Lady Alice be put aboard her, for his fears were steadily increasing that nothing but harm could result from remaining on the lowering sullen Fuwalda. Toward noon, they were within speaking distance of a British vessel, but Clayton had about to decide to ask the captain to put them aboard her. The obvious ridiculousness of such a request became suddenly apparent. What reason could he give the officer commanding Her Majesty's ship for desiring to go back in the direction from which he had just come? Faith, what if them told too that insubordinate seamen had been roughly handled by their officers, they would have laughed at Sleeves and attribute his reason for wishing to leave the ship but to one thing: cowardice. John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, did not ask to be transferred to the British man-of-war, and in late afternoon he saw its upper works fade below the far horizon, but not before he learned that heat which confirmed his greatest fears, and caused him to curse his false pride which had restrained him from seeking safety for his young wife a few short hours before, when safety was within reach, a safety which had now gone forever. It was mid-afternoon that brought the little old sailor, who had been felled by the captain few days before, to where Clayton and his wife stood by the ship's watching ever-diminishing outlines of the great battleship. The old fellow was polishing brasses, and he came edging along until close to Clayton he said, in an undertone, "Elfs to pay, sir, on this aircraft, mark my word for it, elves to pay." "But what do you mean, my good fellow?" asked Clayton. "Why, hasn't ye see what's going on? Hasn't ye heard that devil's spawn of a captain is mates knocking bloomin' lights outen off the crew? 2 busted eads yesterday, and 3 today. Black Michael's as good as new again. He's not the bully to stand for it, and he's marked my word for it, sir." You mean, my man, that the crew contemplates mutiny? Asked Clayton. Mutiny! Exclaimed the old fellow. Mutiny, they means murder, sir. And mark my word for it, sir. When? Hit's comin', sir. Hit's comin', but I'm not sayin' when. And I've too damned much now. But ye was a good sort other day, and I thought it was no more than to warn ye. But keep a still tongue in your head, and when you're shootin', get below and stay there. That's all. Can only keep a still tongue, and or they'll put a pill between your ribs, and mark my word for it. And the old fellow went on polishing, which carried him away from where the Claytons were standing. Dear's cheerful outlook, Alice, said Clayton. You should warn the captain at once, John. Possibly the trouble may be averted, she said. I suppose I should, but yet from purely selfish motives, I am but almost prompted to keep still tongue my head. Yet whatever they would do now will spare in recognition of my stand for this fellow Black Michael. But should they find that I betrayed them, there would be no mercy shown us, Alice. You have but one duty, John. That lies in the interest of vested authority. If you do not warn the captain, you are as much pretty as whatever fellow you had to plot and carry it out with your own head and hands. You do not understand, dear, replied Clayton. It is of you I am thinking. There lies my first duty. The first captain has brought this condition upon myself. So why should I risk subjecting my wife to the unthinkable horrors and probably futile attempt to save him from this own brutal folly? You have no conception, dear, of what follow were this pack of cutthroats to gain control of the Fuwalda. Duty is duty, my husband, and no amount of sophistries may change it. I may be a poor wife for an English lord where I be responsible for this shirking plain duty. I realize that danger must follow, but I can face with you, face much more bravely than the face could dishonor, always knowing that you might have averted a tragedy and not neglected your duty. Have it as you will, then, Alice, he answered, smiling. Maybe we are borrowing trouble. I do not like the things on board the ship. They may not be so bad after all, for it is possible the ancient mariner is but a voicing the desires of his wicked heart rather than speaking of real facts. Mutiny on high sea may have been common 100 years ago, but in this good year 1888 is least likely of happenings. But there goes the captain in his cabin now. If I am going to warn him, I might as well get the beastly job over, for I have little stomach to talk with the brute at all. So saying, he strolled carelessly in the direction of the companionway through the captain, which had paused, a moment later knocking at his door. Come in, growled the deep tones of the surly officer, and when Clayton had entered, the door closed behind him. Well, I have come to report the gist of a conversation I heard today, because I feel that, well, there may be nothing to it. It is well that you are to be forearmed. In short, the men contemplate mutiny and murder. It's a lie, roared the captain, and if you have been interfering with the discipline of the ship or meddling in affairs that don't concern you, you can take the consequences and be damned. I don't care whether you are an English lord or not. I am the captain of the ship, and from now on you keep your meddling at nose out of my business. As he reached for his peroration, the captain had worked himself to such a frenzy of rage that he was fairly purple of face, and shrieked his last words at the top of his voice, emphasizing his remarks and loud thumping the table of one fist, shaking the other in Clayton's face. Greystoke never turned a half, but stood eyeing the excited man at a level gaze. Captain Billings, he drawled finally, If you pardon my candor, I might remark that you are something of an ass, don't you know? Whereupon he turned the left with the captain, the same indifferent ease that his habitual him, and it was more surely calculated to raise the ear of man of Billings' class to an deterrent interactive. So the captain might easily have been brought to regret his hasty speech, and Clayton attempted to consolate him. His temper was now irrevocably set in the mold of which Clayton had left it, and which the chance of their working together for common good and preservation of life was gone. "Well, Alice," said Clayton as he rejoined his wife, "if I saved my breath, I should likewise saved myself a bit calling. The fellow proved most ungrateful, fairly jumped at me like a mad dog. He and his blasted old ship may go hang, for I ought care until we are safe off the thing. I shall spend my intervals in looking after our own welfare, and I rather fancy the first step that end should be to go our cabin and to look at my revolvers. I am sorry now that we packed the larger guns and ammunition with the stuff below." They found their quarters in a bad state of disorder. Clothing from their boxes strewed their apartment, and even their beds torn places. "Evidently someone was more anxious about our belongings than we," said Clayton. "By Jove, I wonder what Bounder was after. Let's have a look around, Alice. Let's see what's missing." Though a thorough search revealed that the fact that nothing taken but Clayton's 2 revolvers and a small supply of ammunition he had saved for them. "Those were the very things I wish they most had left us," said Clayton, "and the fact they had wished them and them alone is the sinister circumstance of all that had transpired and to endanger since we foot this miserable hulk." "What are we to do, John?" asked his wife. "I shall not urge you to go again for the captain, for I cannot see you affronted further. Possibly our best chance for salvation is maintaining lies in a neutral position. If the officers are able to prevent a mutiny, we have nothing to fear, while if the mutineers are victorious, our hope is slim, lies in not having attempt to thwart or antagonize them." "Right you are, Alice. We'll keep in the middle of the road." As they fell to an effort to straighten up their cabin, Clayton and his wife simultaneously noticed the corner of the piece of paper protruding from beneath the door from their quarters. Clayton stooped to reach as he was amazed further into the room, and then he realized that it was being pushed inward by some from outwards. Quickly and silently he stepped toward the door, but as he reached for the knob to throw it open, his wife's hand fell upon his wrist. "No, John," she whispered. "They do not wish to be seen, so we cannot afford to see them. Do not forget that we are keeping the middle of the road." Clayton smiled and dropped his hand to his side. Thus they stood watching a little bit of white paper until it finally remained at rest upon the floor inside the door. Then Clayton stooped and picked it up. It was a bit grimy, white paper, roughly folded in ragged square. Opening, they found a crude message printed in Acouth letters, with many evidences of a accustomed task. Translated, it was a warning to the Claytons to refrain from reporting the loss of the revolvers, or from repeating what the old sailor had told them, to refrain the pain of death. "I rather we imagine will be good," said Clayton with a rueful smile. "About we all can do is sit tight and wait for whatever may come." Chapter 2. The Savage Home. Nor did they have long to wait, for the next morning, as Clayton was emerging on the deck, for his accustomed walk before breakfast, a shot rang out, and then another, and then another. The sight which met his eyes confirmed the worst fears. Facing the little knot of officers was the entire motley crew of the Fualda, and their head stood Black Michael. At the first volley, the officers ran for the shelter, and from the points of vantage behind the mast, wheelhouse, the cabinet, they returned the fire of 5 men who represented and hated the authority of the ship. 2 of their number had gone down before the captain's revolver. They had fallen between the combatants. Presently, the first mate lunged toward upon his face, and at the cry command from Black Michael, the bloodthirsty ruffians charged the remaining 4. The crew had been able to muster but 6 firearms, so most of them were armed with boat hooks, axes, hatchets, and crowbars. The captain had emptied his revolver and was loading with a charge was made. The second mate's gun had jammed, and so there were but 2 weapons opposed to the mutineers as they rapidly approached the officers, and now started to give back before the infuriated of their men. Both sides were cursing and swearing with a frightful manner, which, together with it, reports of firearms and screams of groans of the wounded, turned the deck of the Fuwalda like the likeness of a madhouse. Before the officers had taken a dozen steps, the men were upon them. An axe in the hands of a burly negro cleft, and the captain forward head to chin. An instant others were down, dead or wounded from dozens blows or bullet wounds. Shot and gristly had been worked the mutineers of the Fuwalda, and through it all John Clayton had stood carelessly beside this companionway, puffing meditatively upon his pipe, though he had but watching an indifferent cricket match. As the last officer went down, bethought him that he had time to return his wife. At least some members of the crew had alone below. Though outwardly calm and indifferent, Clayton was inwardly apprehensive and wrought up, for he feared for his silent wife's safety at his hands of these ignorant half-brutes whose hands and fate had so remorselessly thrown them. As he turned to descend the ladder, he had surprised to see his wife standing on the steps at his side. "How long have you been here, Alice?" "Since the beginning," she replied. "How awful, John! Oh, how awful! How can we hope for the hands of such those?" "Breakfast, I hope," he answered, smiling bravely in an attempt to allay her fears. "At least," he added, "I'm going to ask them. Come with me. We must not think them any but courteous treatment." The men had time but surrounded the dead, wounded officers, and without either partially or compassion, proceeded to both living and dead the sides of the vessel. With equal heartlessness, they disposed their own wounded bodies of the sailors of whom merciful Providence had vouchsafed instant death before the bullets of the officers. Presently, one of the crew was by the approaching Claytons, with the cry, "Here's 2 more of the fishes," replied toward them with uplifted axe. But Black Michael was even quicker, so that the fellow went down with a bullet in his back before he had taken half a dozen steps. With a loud roar, Black Michael attracted the attention of the others, and pointing to the Lord and Lady Greystoke, cried, "These here are my friends. They are left alone. D'ye understand? I'm the captain of this ship now, and what I say goes," he added, turning to Clayton. "Just keep to yourselves, and nobody will harm ye." And he looked threateningly on to his fellows. Clayton's heeded Black Michael's instructions so that they saw but little of the crew and knew nothing of the plans men were making. Occasionally they heard the faint echoes of brawls quarreling among the mutineers, and on 2 occasions the vicious bark of firearms on the still air. But Black Michael was a fit leader of the heterogeneous cutthroats, and withal had held the subjection of his rule. On the 5th day following the murder of the ship's officers, land was sighted by the lookout. Whether island or mainland, Black Michael did not know, but he announced that that if the investigation showed that the place was habitable, then Lady Greystoke would be put ashore with their belongings. You will be all right here for a few months, he explained, and that by the time we'll be able to be inhabited somewhere is by a bit, scatter a bit. Then I'll see what your government's notified where there'll be soon, and man o' war fetch ye off. You'll may be all right, but it would be a hard matter to land you in a civilization without a lot of questions being asked, and none of us here any convincing answers up our sleeves. Clayton remonstrated against the inhumanity of landing upon the unknown shore to be left mercies of savage beasts, and possibly more savage men. But his words were to no avail, and only tended anger in Black Michael, so he was forced to detest and make the best he could of the bad situation. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon he came to the beautiful wooded shore opposite of the mouth that we appeared to be a landlocked harbor. Black Michael sent a small boat filled with men sound entrance with an effort to determine if Walda could be safely worked through the entrance. In about half an hour they returned and reported deep water through the passage as well as fair into the little basin. Before dark the Bartnets lay peacefully at anchor upon the bosom of the still, mirror-like surface of the harbor, and the surrounding shores were beautiful with semi-tropical verdure, while the distance of the country rose from the ocean hill and tableland almost uniformly clothed in primeval forest. No signs of habitation were visible, but the land might easily support human life was evidented by the abundance of animal life, and the watchers of the Walda deck caught occasional glimpses as well as the shimmer of a little river which emptied into the harbor, ensuring a fresh water plentiful. As darkness settled upon the earth, Clayton and Lady Alice stood by the ship's rail in silent contemplation of their future abode. From the darkness shadows of the mighty forest came wild calls of average beasts, the deep roar with the lion, and occasionally the shrill scream of a panther. The woman shrank closer to the man in a terror-stricken anticipation, the horrors lying in wait for them in the awful blackness of the nights to come, when they too should be alone that the wild, lonely shore. Later in the evening, Black Michael joined them long enough to instruct to make their preparations for a landing marrow. They tried to persuade him to take them to a more hospitable and coast near enough to civilization so that they might hope to fall into some friendly hands. But no pleas or threats or promises of reward could move him. I am only a man aboard who could not see you both safely dead, and while I know it's not sensible to make sure of our own necks, yet Black Michael not the man to forget a favor. You saved my life once, and in return I'm going to spare yours, but that's all I can do. The men won't be stand for any more, and if you get landed pretty quick, may even change your minds about giving you much show. But I'll put your stuff ashore as you are cooking utensils, some old sails for tents, and enough grub to get you at least until you can find some fruit and game. So that your guns and protection, you ought to be able to live here easy enough until help comes. When I get safely hid away, you'll see it into the British government learns about where you be. For the life of me couldn't tell where you exactly are, for I don't know myself, but they'll find you all right. After he had left them, they silently below that each wrapped in gloomy forebodings. Clayton did not believe that Black Michael had slightest intention of notifying the British government about their whereabouts, nor was he any too sure about the treachery was contemplated for the following day when they should be on shore and with the sailors who would have accompanied them with their belongings. Once out of Black Michael's sight, any of men strike down, and still Black Michael's conscience clear, and then they should escape the fate, but not be faced with far greater dangers. Alone he might be hoped to survive for years, for he was strong, athletic man. But what of Alice, and what of the other life so soon launched amidst the hardships of grave dangers and primeval world? The man shuddered and meditated upon the gravity, the fearful helpfulness of their situation, but it was a merciful providence which prevented them from foreseeing a hideous reality which awaited them in the grip depths of the gloomy wood. Early morning, their numerous chests and boxes were hoisted on deck and lowered, waiting small boats for transportation shore. There was a great quantity of variety of stuff, as Clayton expected possible 5-8 years residence of their new home, so that in addition to the many necessities they had brought were also luxuries. Black Michael was determined that nothing belonging to the Claytons should be left abroad. Whether out of compassion for them or in furtherance of his own interests, it was difficult to say. There is no question that the presence of property of a missing British official upon suspicious vessel would have been difficult to explain in any civilized part of the world. So zealous that he, in his efforts to carry out his intentions, that he insisted upon the return of Clayton's revolvers to him by the sailors whose possession they were. Into the small boats they were also loaded salt meats and biscuit, and the small supply of potatoes and beans, matches and cooking vessels, the chest of tools, and the old sails of which Black Michael had promised them. As though himself fearing the very thing which Clayton had suspected, Black Michael accompanied them to the shore, and was last to leave them when the small boats, having filled the ship's casks with fresh water, were pushed out toward the waiting Fuwalda. As the boats moved slowly toward the smooth water of the bay, Clayton and his wife silently watching their departure, in the breasts of both feeling an impending disaster and utter hopelessness. And behind them, over the edge of the low ridge, other eyes watched, close-set, wicked eyes gleaming beneath the shaggy brows. As the Fuwalda passed through the narrow entrance of the harbor and out of the sight of the projecting point, Lady Alice threw her arms about Clayton's neck and burst into uncontrolled sobs. Bravely he had faced the dangers of the mutiny. With heroic fortitude he had looked into the terrible future. But now the horror of absolute solitude was upon them. Her overwrought nerves gave way, and the reaction came. He did not attempt to check her tears. It were better than that nature, in her way, relieving those long pent emotions, and it was many minutes before the girl, little more than the child she was, could again gain the mastery of herself. "Oh, John," she cried at last, "the horror of it! What are we to do? What are we to do?" "There is but one thing to do, Alice." As he spoke quietly, as though they were sitting snug in their living room home, "that is work. Work must be our salvation. We must not give ourselves time to think. From in that direction lies madness. We must work and wait. I am sure that the relief will come, and come quickly. And when once it is more apparent the Fuwalda has been lost, even though Black Michael does not keep his word to us." "But John, if it were only you and I," she sobbed. "We could endure it, I know, but—" "Yes, dear," he answered gently. "I have been thinking of that also, but we must face it, as we face whatever comes, bravely and with utmost confidence, and our ability to cope with circumstances, whatever they may be. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, our ancestors of the dim and distant past faced the same problems which we must face, possibly in the same primeval forests. That we are here today evidences our victory. What did they do? Not do that we may not. And even better, for we are not armed with ages of superior knowledge, and we have not the means of protection, defense, and sustenance which science has given us, from which we are totally ignorant. What they can accomplish, Alice, with instruments and weapons of stone and bone, surely we may also accomplish. Ah, John, I wish that I might be with a man's philosophy, but I am a woman, seeing with the heart rather than my head, and that all I can see is too horrible, too unthinkable to put into words. I only hope you are right, John, but I will do my best to be brave and primeval woman, and fit mate for a primeval man. Clayton's first thought was to arrange a sleeping shelter for the night, something which might serve to protect them from the prowling beasts of prey. He opened the box containing his rifles and ammunition, and they might be both armed against the possible attack at work, and then they together sought the location of the first night's sleeping place. 100 yards from the beach, a little level spot, fairly free of trees, and they decided to eventually build a permanent house. But for the time being, they both thought it was best to construct a little platform in the trees of the reach larger than the savage beasts of whom realm they were. To this end, Clayton, 4 trees which rectangle about square feet, and cutting the long branches of other trees, constructed framework around them, about 10 feet of the ground, fastening the ends branches securely by the means of rope, quantity which Black Michael had furnished him from Hold the Fuwalda. Across the framework, Clayton placed other smaller branches quite close together. This platform paved with huge fronds of elephant ear which grew in a profusion about them, and through the fronds he laid a great sail folded in several thickness. 7 feet higher he constructed a similar, though lighter, platform to serve as a roof, and though the sides he suspended the balance of his sailcloth walls, he was completed and was rather snug little nest, to which he had carried their blankets and some lighter luggage. It was now late in the afternoon, and the balance of the daylight hours were devoted in the building of a rude ladder by which means of Lady Alice could mount in her new home. All day in the day, forests about them had been filled with excited birds of brilliant plumage, dancing, chattering monkeys who watched their new arrivals and their wonderful nest-building operations with every mark of the keenest interest and fascination. All during the day, of forest about had been filled with excited birds of brilliant plumage, dancing and chattering monkeys, who would watch these new arrivals and their wonderful nest-building operations with every mark of keenest interest and fascination. Notwithstanding that both Clayton and his wife kept a sharp outlook, they had saw nothing but larger animals, though on 2 occasions a day they had seen their little simian neighbors come screaming and chattering by the nearby ridge, casting affrighted glances back over the little shoulders, and evincing as plainly as though by speech they were fleeing some terrible thing by which concealed there. Just before dusk, Clayton finished his ladder, and filling a great basin with water from which the nearby stream, the 2 mounted a comparative safety of the aerial chamber. It was quite warm. Clayton had left the side curtains back over by the roof. As they squatted, like Turks, upon their blankets, Lady Alice, straining their eyes into darkening shadows of the wood, suddenly reached out and grasped Clayton's arm. "John," she said, "look, what is it? A man?" As Clayton turned his eyes in the direction indicated, he saw silhouetted dimly lit against the shadows beyond, a great figure standing upright upon the ridge. For a moment it stood listening, and turned slowly, and melted into the shadows of the jungle. "What is it, John?" "I do not know, Alice," he answered gravely. "It is too dark to see so far, and it may have been turned but a shadow cast off by the rising moon." "No, John, if it were a man, it was huge and grotesque mockery of a man. Oh, I am afraid." He gathered her in her arms, whispering the words of courage into her ear, for the greatest pain of misfortunes to Clayton was mere mental anguish of his young wife, himself a brave fearlessness, yet he was able to appreciate awful suffering for her entails, a rare gift, though but one of many had which made young Lord Greystoke respected and loved by all who knew him. Soon after, he lowered the curtain walls, trying to secure the trees so that, except for a little opening toward the beach, they were entirely closed. As it was now pitch dark that with their entire area they lay down upon their blankets to try to rest. Though sleep, the brief respite and forgetfulness, Clayton lay facing the opening front, the rifle and braced revolvers at his hand. Securely, they had closed their eyes, and then the terrifying cry of a panther rang out from the jungle behind them. Closer and closer it came until they could hear a great beast directly beneath them. For an hour or more they had heard sniffing and clawing of the trees which had supported their platform, but at last it roamed away across the beach, where Clayton could see it clearly in the brilliant moonlight, great, handsome, and largest he had ever seen, during which the hours they had caught but the fitfulness of sleep, for the night of noises of jungle teeming the myriad animal life kept their overwrought nerves on edge, so that the 100 times they were startled to wakefulness by piercing screams or the stealthy moving great bodies of beneath them. Chapter 3. Life and Death. Morning found them but all refreshed, though it was a feeling of intense relief that they saw the day of dawn. As though they had made the major breakfast of salt pork, coffee, and biscuit, Clayton commenced work upon their house, for he realized they could hope for no more safety and no peace of mind at night until 4 strong walls effectually barred the jungle life from them. The task was an arduous one and required the better part of a month. Though he had built but one small room, he constructed his cabinet of small logs about 6 inches in diameter, stopping his chinks in clay which he found at the depths of the few feet beneath the surface soil. At one he built a fireplace of small stones from the beach. These he also set in clay, and when the house had been entirely completed, he applied the coating of the clay to the entire surface of the thickness of 4 inches. In the window opening, he set small branches about an inch in diameter, both vertically and horizontally, so woven that they formed a substantial grating and could withstand the strength of a powerful animal. And thus they attained the proper ventilation without fear of lessening the safety of the cabin. The A-shaped roof that thatched with small branches laid close together of these long jungle grass and palm fronds, and the final coating of the clay. The door he built his pieces and packing boxes he had led their belongings, nailing one piece upon another, the grain contiguous layers running transversely, until he had solid body some 3 inches thick and such a great strength that they had both moved to laughter that they had gazed upon it. Here the greatest difficulty confronted Clayton, for he had no means whereby to hang his massive door which built. After 2 days' work, however, he succeeded in a fashioning of 2 massive hardwood hinges, and he hung the door and opened it and closed easily. The stucconing and other final touches were added after they moved the house, which was done as soon as the roof was on, piling their boxes before the door at night, thus having a comparatively safe and comfortable habitation. The building of a bed, chairs, table, and shelves was relatively easier matter, so that by the end of the 2nd month they had well settled, but for a constant dread of attack by wild beasts and the ever-growing loneliness, they were uncomfortable or unhappy. But at night the great beasts snarled and roared at their tiny cabin, but so accustomed may one could become to oft-repeated noises, so that soon they paid little attention to them, sleeping soundly through the whole night. The brilliant birds and the little monkeys had accustomed them to their new acquaintances, and they had evidently ever seen a human being so presently. after they had first sight had been worn off, approached closer and closer, impelled by the strange curiosity which dominates the wild creatures in the forests of the jungle and plain, so that within the first month of several birds had gone so far as to accept the morsels of food from the friendly hands of the Claytons. One afternoon, while Clayton was working upon the addition of their cabin, for he had completed after several more rooms, a number of their grotesque friends came shrieking and scolding through the trees and from the direction of the ridge. Ever as they fled, cast fearful glances back at them, and finally they stopped near Clayton, jabbering excitedly to him to warn him of approaching danger. At last he saw it, and the thing the little monkeys so feared, the man of brute of which the Claytons had occasional feeding glimpses. It was approaching through the jungle at a semi-erect position, now then placing its backs as close as fists upon the ground, the great anthropoid ape, and as it advanced, it emitted guttural growls and occasional low barking sound. Clayton was at some distance from the cabin, having come to fell a particularly perfect tree. From his building operations, grown careless from months, they continued safely, by the time which no dangerous animals during the daylight hours. He had left rifles and revolvers all within the little cabin. And now he had saw the great ape crashing through the underbush directly toward him, and from the direction which practically cut him off from escape, felt a vague little shiver play up, down, and down his spine. He knew that, armed only with an axe, his chances with a ferocious monster were small indeed. And Alice, oh God, he thought, what will become of Alice? There he was a slight chance of reaching his death. He returned and ran for it, shouting to an alarm to his wife, and enclosed the great door of the case of the ape, cut off his retreat. Lady Greystoke had been sitting a little away from the cabin, and when she heard his cry, looked up to see the springing of the almost incredible swiftness for so large and awkward an animal, and an effort off his Clayton, with a low cry, sprang toward the cabin, and as she entered, gave a backward glance and filled her soul with terror, for the brute had intercepted her husband, who now stood by bay, gasping, his axe in both hands, and swinging it upon the infuriated animal should he make his final change. "Close the bolt and bolt the door, Alice," cried Clayton. "I can finish this fellow with my axe." But he knew he was facing a horrible death, and so did she. The ape was a great bull, weighing probably 300 pounds. His nasty, close-set eyes gleamed hatred beneath his shaggy browns, while his canine teeth were bared in his snarl as he paused as a moment before his prey. Over the brute's shoulder, Clayton could see a doorway of his cabin, not 20 paces distant, but a great wave of horror and fear swept over him as he saw his young wife emerge with one of his rifles. She had always been afraid of firearms and would never touch them, but now she rushed towards the ape with a fearless lioness protecting its young. "Back, Alex!" shouted Clayton. "For God's sake, go back!" But she would not heed, and just as the ape charged, so did Clayton could say no more. The man swung his axe with his almighty strength, but his powerful brute seized those terrible hands, and tearing his Clayton's grasp, hurled it far to one side. With an ugly snarl, he closed upon his defenseless victim, but an ear fangs had reached his throat, thirsted for. There were sharp report at a bullet, and the ape's back between his shoulders, throwing Clayton to the ground. The beast upon the enemy, there before the terrified girl, vainly trying to fire another bullet into the animal's body. But she did not understand the mechanism of the firearm, and the hammer fell futilely upon the empty cartridge. Almost simultaneously, Clayton regained his feet, and without thought of utter hopelessness of it, he rushed toward the drag of ape in his wife's prostrate form. A hasty examination of his wife revealed no marks upon her, and Clayton decided a huge brute had died sprung forward from Alice. Gently, he lifted his wife's unconscious form and bore a little cabin, but his fully 2 hours before she regained consciousness. Her first words filled Clayton with a vague appreciation. For some time after regaining her senses, Alice gazed wonderingly about the interior of the little cabin, and then, with a satisfied sigh, said, "Oh, John, it is so good to be home. I have had an awful dream, dear. I thought we were no longer in London, but in a horrible place where great beasts attacked us." There, Alice," he said, stroking her forehead. "Try to sleep again. Do not worry about your head and about bad dreams." That night, little son was born in Tybee cabin beside their primeval forest, while a leopard screamed before the door, and the deep notes of the lion's roar sounded beyond the ridge. Lady Greystoke had never recovered from the shock of the great ape's attack, and though she lived for a year after the baby was born, she was never again outside the cabin, nor did she fully realize that she was not in England. Sometimes she would question Clayton as the strange noises at night, the absence of servants and friends, the strange rudeness of the furnishings of her room. Though she had no effort to deceive her, she could not grasp the meaning of it all. And in other ways, she was quite rational. The joy and happiness she took in the possession of her little son and the constant attractions of her husband made that year very happy for her, the happiest of her young life. That would have been the best set of worries of apprehension that she had been full in command of mental faculties Clayton knew well, so that he suffered terribly to see her so. There were times she was almost glad, for her sake, that she could not understand. Long since she had given up any hope, rescue, except though on accident, with unremitting zeal, had worked upon to beautify the interior of the cabin. Skins of lion and panther covered the floor. Cupboards and bookcases lined the wall. Odd vases made by his own hand from clay region held beautiful tropical flowers. Curtains of grass and bamboo covered the windows, and the most arduous task of all, with his meager assortment of tools had fashioned lumber so to neatly seal the walls and ceiling and lay smooth floor within the cabin, that he had been able to turn his hands at all to an unaccustomed labor and was a source of mild wonder to him. But he loved the work because it was for her an Italian life that had come to cheer him, though adding 100-fold of his responsibilities and the terribleness of their situation. During the year that followed, Clayton was several times more attacked by the gray apes, and now seemed continuously infest the vicinity of the cabin. But as he never again ventured outside, both with rifle and revolvers, he had little fear of the huge beasts. At first, he shot much game from the cabin windows, but toward the end, animals learned to fear a strange lair from whose issued terrifying thunder rifle. At other times, Clayton wrote in his diary, which he had always been accustomed to keep in French, and though he recorded the details in a strange life, this book kept locked in the little metal box. A year from the day her little son was born, Lady Alice passed quietly in the night. So peaceful was her end, it was the hours before Clayton could awake to the realization that his wife was dead. The horror of the situation came to him very slowly. It was doubtful that he ever realized the enormity of his sorrow and fearful responsibility that had developed upon him with care of the wee thing. His son, still a nursing babe. The last entry of his diary was made in the morning following her death. There he recited the sad details of the matter-of-fact way that adds to the pathos of it. For the breaths of a tired apathy born of a long sorrow and hopelessness, which even his cruel blow could scarcely awake the further suffering. My little son is crying for nourishment. Oh, Alice, Alice, what shall I do? For a long time, no sound broke the death-like stillness of the jungle midday, save the piteous wailing of the tiny man-child. Chapter 4. the apes. In the forest of the tableland and a mile back from the ocean of Old Cherkek, the ape was on a rampage of rage among his people. The younger and lighter members of his tribe scampered to the higher branches of the great trees to escape his wrath, risking their own lives upon the branches that scarce supported their weight in the face of the Old Cherkek in one of the fits of uncontrolled anger. The other males scattered in all directions, but not before his infuriated breed had of the vertebrae of one snap great between his great foaming jaws. The luckless young female slipped an insecure hold upon his high branch and came crushing to the ground almost at Cherkek's feet. With a wild scream, she was upon her, tearing a great piece of her slide with a mighty teeth, and striking her viciously upon the head, shoulders with a broken tree limb until her skull was crushed to a jelly. And then he spied Kala, who, returning from the search for food with her young babe, was ignorant of the state of the mighty male's temper until suddenly a shrill of warnings of her follow caused her to scamper madly for safety. But Cherkek was close upon her, so close that he had almost grasped her ankle, and she could not made a furious leap far into the space from one tree to another. A perilous chance from which apes could ever take, unless was so closely pursued danger there was no alternative. She made the leap successfully, but she grasped a limb of the further tree. A sudden jar loosened the hold of the tiny babe where it clung frantically to her neck. Then she saw the little thing hurled, turning and twisting, through the ground 30 feet below. With a low cry of dismay, Caleb rushed headlong to the side, thoughtless now the dangers of Cherkek. But when got heard the we mangled to her bosom, life had left it. With the low moans, she sat cuddling her body next to her, nor did Cherkek attempt to molest her. With the death of the babe, the fit of demoniacal rage passed as suddenly as seized him. Cherkek was a huge king ape, weighing perhaps 350 pounds. His forehead was extremely low and receding, his eyes bloodshot, small and close to his coarse, flat nose, his ears large and thin, but smaller than most of his kind. His awful temper and his mighty strength made him a supreme among the tribe into which he had been born into his 20 years before. Now that he was in his prime, there was no simian in all the mighty forest in which ever roved that he dared contest to his right of rule, nor did the larger animals molest him. Old Tantor the elephant alone was a wild savage life, feared him not. He was alone Cherkek fear. When Tantor trumpeted, the great ape scurried and fellows high among the trees a second terrace. The tribe of arthropods over the Cherkek ruled with an iron hand and bared fangs, numbered some 6 or 8 families, each family consisting of an adult male with his wives and the young, numbering in all which 60 or 70 ages. Kala was the youngest wife of the male called Tublat, meaning a broken nose. The child had seen dashed to death to her first, for she was but 9 or 10 years old. Notwithstanding her youth, she was a large but powerful, a splendid, clean-limbed animal, with a round, high forehead which denoted more intelligence than most of her kind possessed. She also had a greater capacity for mother love and mother sorrow, but she was still an ape, a huge, fierce, terrible beast of a species closely allied to the gorilla, yet more intelligent, which, with the strength of the cousin, made her most fearsome of awe-inspiring progenitors of a man. But she was still an ape, a huge, fierce, terrible beast of a species closely allied to the gorilla, yet more intelligent, which the strength of their cousin, she had made her kind most fearsome, those awe-inspiring progenitors of a man. Then, when the tribe saw the Cherkek rage, she ceased to come slowly down from her arboreal retreats and pursued them with the various occupations of which she had interrupted. The young played, the frolicked about his trees of bushes. Some adults lay prone upon the soft mat, dead and decaying vegetation which covered the ground, while others turned over pieces, fallen branches of clods, earth in search of small bugs and reptiles from which formed the part of food. Others again searched the surrounding trees for fruits, nuts, small birds, and eggs. They had passed an hour and so when Cherkak called them together, and a word of command then followed them towards off the sea. But then though the lower trees moved swiftly, swinging from branch to branch with the agility of smaller cousins, the monkeys, and then Calla carried their little dead baby hung by the breast. It was shortly after noon they had reached the ridge overlooking the beach, where they had a tiny cottage which had the Kerchak's goal. He had seen many of his kind go to their deaths before the loud noise that made black stick of the hands of the strange white ape who lived in the wonderful lair. And Kerchak had laid up his brute mind to own death-dealing contrivance and to explore the interior of the mysterious den. He wanted very, very much to feel his teeth sink into the neck of the queer animal that he leaned to hate and fear. And because of this, he came often with his tribe to reconnoiter, waiting for a time to his white ape should be off his guard. Of late he had quit attacking, or even showing themselves, for every time they had done so to the past little stick he had roared to his terrible message of death and some member of the tribe. Today there has no sign of man about it, and from there where he watched they could see the cabinet door open. Slowly, cautiously, though noisily, they crept through the jungle toward the little cabin. There was no growls, no fierce screams of rage. The little black stick had taught them to come quietly to awaken it. On and on they came until Kerchak himself slunk stealthily into the very door and peered within. Behind him were two males, then Calla, closely straining the little dead from her breast. Inside the den they saw a strange white ape lying half across the table, his head buried in arms, and his bed lay a figure covered by sailcloth, while a tiny rustic cradle came plaintive, wailing a babe. Noisily Kerchak entered, crouching the change, and John Clayton rose with a sudden start and faced them. The slight-met eyes must have frozen upon him with horror, for there, with the door, three great bull apes, while behind the crowded many more, how many he never knew, for his revolvers were hanging from the far beside the rifle, and the Kerchak charging. When the king realized the limp form from the John Clayton gray stroke, he had now attention the little cradle, but Calla was there before him, and when he would have grasped the child and snatched it for herself, and before he could intercept, he had bolted through her door and taken refuge in the high tree. And as he shook the little baby, the little Alice Clayton, she had dropped the dead body of her own into the empty cradle, for the wall of the living answered she had called the universal motherhood within her breast, which could dead still not. High up among the branches of the tree she hugged the shrieking infant in her bosom, and soon she instinct was a dominant, fierce female, and had been in her breast a tender, beautiful mother. The instinct mother of love reached out in the tiny child's half-formed understanding and became quiet. The hunger closed the gap between them, and the son of an English lord and the English nurse at the breast of Calla, and the great ape, and the maintenance of the breast in the cabin, and were warily examining the contents of the strange lair. Once satisfied that Clayton was dead, Kerchak turned his attention so that the thing that lay upon the bed, covered by a piece of sailcloth. Gingerly he lifted the corner of the shroud, but when the body of the woman beneath the tore cloth roughly from her form seized still the white throat in his huge hairy hands. The moment that he let his fingers sink deep into the cold flesh, and then realizing she was solely dead, he turned to her to examine the contents of the room, nor did he again molest the body of either Lady Alice nor Sir John. The rifle hanging upon the wall caught his attention first. It was a strange, death-dealing thunderstick that he had yearned for months, but now it was within his grasp. He had scarcely the tremidity to seize it. Cautiously he approached the thing, ready to flee precipitately should he speak its deep roaring tones, as he heard it speak before. Its last words those of its kind who, though ignorance and rashness he had attacked, wonderful great white ape had borne it. Deep in the beast's intelligence was something which assured that the thunderstick was only dangerous within the hands of one who could manipulate it. But yet, several minutes ere he could not bring himself to touch it. Instead, he walked back and forth along the floor before it, turning his head ever so once before his own desire. Presently he halted before the rifle, slowly raised his huge hand up till it almost touched the shining barrel, only to withdraw once more and continued his hurried pacing. And though it was a great brute to show his fearfulness, though the medium wild voice endeavoring bolster up his courage to the point which permit him to take the rifle in his hand. Again he stopped, and the time succeeded, forcing his reluctant to cold steel, only to snatch it almost immediately to resume his restless beat. Time after time, strange ceremony repeated, but on occasion with increased confidence, until finally the rifle torn from his hook and lay in the grasp of his great brute. Finding not be harmed, Kerchak began to examine it closely. He felt it from end to end, peered it for the black muzzle, fingered the sights, the breech, the stock, finally the trigger. During these operations, the apes had entered the huddled door near the chief, while the outside strained and the crowd of catch a glimpse of transpired within. Suddenly, Kerchak's finger closed upon the trigger. There was a deafening roar in the little room, and the apes beyond the door fell over in the wild anxiety to escape. Kerchak was equally frightened, so frightened, in fact, he quite forgot to throw aside the author of the fearful noise. He bolted the door with the tightly clutched in one hand. As he passed through the opening, the slight front of the rifle caught upon the edge of the swinging door sufficient force to tightly after the fleeing ape. It was an hour before the apes could again bring themselves approach the cabin, continue their investigations, and when they finally did so, they found their charge in that the door was so securely fastened that they could not force it. The cleverly constructed latch Clayton had made for door had sprung. Kerchak passed down, for the apes could find means ingress through the heavy barred windows. After roaming about the victimy of a short time, they started back for the deeper of the higher land whence they had come. Those the apes had escaped attempted to examine Kala's strange baby were repulsed by the bared fangs of the menacing growls, accompanied by the words of the warning from Kala. It was though her baby was frail and delicate, feared the raw hands of fellows, and it might injure the little thing. Although she did, in which traveling the onerous triumph for her, resembling the death of her own little one, she clung desperately to a new babe. With one hand, whenever she was upon to march, the other young rode upon their mother's back, among their little arms, clasping their hairy necks before them, while their legs were locked beneath their mother's armpits. Not so with Calla. She held the small of the little Lord Greystoke tightly to her breast, where the dainty hands clutched the long black hair which had covered the portion of her body. She had seen the child fall from her black, terrible death, and she would take no further chances with this.